this is a pilot episode, which means that we can do whatever we want, whatever direction we want to take it. This project doesn't have a name yet, but we probably should begin by introducing ourselves.
Okay, that sounds good.
We could also start by talking about how we first kind of started to communicate, because that might fill in some of the blanks as well.
Yeah, okay. And I guess I would take credit for that. I think that was my doing. I remember coming across, I don't know if it was on the Philosophy Updates listserv or how, but I remember coming across your Biota Live discussion on artificial life. And I think I just emailed you. I must have found your email address online and emailed you and said, I think this is great. I love that you're putting together this artificial life group, and this is something I've been interested in independently as an academic, as a philosopher. You know, nobody in sort of my group or my department working on anything like that. And then I guess you and I just kept in touch, and eventually you asked me to talk about artificial life on one of those podcasts. And that's when I talked to Dick Gordon, which kind of spun off in another direction, and I did a bunch of projects with them. But for the artificial life stuff, I put together, I don't know if you remember, so many years ago now, that sort of online repository of artificial life guest speakers, and I don't know if that actually went anywhere. But yeah, it was just cool to come across somebody outside of, you know, academia, so to speak, who was working on artificial life and doing all this cool work. So I guess that had to be, I don't know, 2008 or 2009.
Yeah, it was about that time frame, I would have thought. So I always think of this as in terms of where I was living at the time.
Yeah, me too.
So we bought a house in November 2009. I can't recall. I think almost all the recordings I did with you were from the house. I don't think we did any from the apartment, which would have put it towards the end of 2009.
Yeah. That sounds right, 2009.
Yeah, the Biota project is an interesting one. In fact, I'm going to put this audio in the Biota feed, so for folks who have obviously listened to the back catalogue, it will exist in that audio form at least till we decide what we want to do with this general discussion. Mm-hmm. Biota, for me, was basically a trajectory of about probably 6 to maybe 10 years of communicating with Bruce Damer initially, then starting to record the Biota podcasts, and then getting to the point where all the regular participants were doing other things. So Jeffrey Ventrella, Gerald de Jong, Steve Grand, they all kind of moved on to work on their own startup projects and these kind of things. Larry Yeager is now working at Google, so he can't contribute the time that he put into Polyworld, although I was able to get him involved with a local talk series that I organised for last year and early this year called Conscious in the Cloud. But Biota as an entity, I think, probably could continue. My only concern with it is associated with Bruce Damer's kind of connection and long-term involvement, because he's now very actively talking against the notion of artificial life on a few levels. And it's quite strange having someone who's organised Biota up until now being one of its strongest kind of critics in a somewhat strange fashion. So anyway, Bruce and I are going to get together for lunch in a few weeks' time, and no doubt this will be discussed. It's been discussed actually quite actively through what's appeared in the Biota recordings, and also he was part of Conscious in the Cloud and gave a talk at Conscious in the Cloud. But from my own perspective, I've continued to work on Noble Ape, which is the project that I started working on in 1996. And it's gone in a variety of different directions. I also went to the Artificial Life Conference in 2012 and spent some time with artificial life academics. And that was a strange interaction. Because the benefit of actually doing Biota recordings was that I never actually needed to be in the same space with any of the participants. I knew Bruce Damer physically, and I've met Jeffrey Ventrella, and I've met Larry Yeager now. But actually being in academic institutions, talking to academics, getting a sense of what their day-to-day life was very strange for me, because I would have thought that they would have embraced certain aspects, particularly the biological complexity or just the general complexity that I tried to put into Noble Ape, and they just weren't ready for it. So it was one of these strange things where I realised that it's almost like a cargo cult, that I'd cultivated this kind of cargo cult of what artificial life was, and then when I emerged out of the jungle to talk to the people that had created the Artificial Life Conference series and all these kind of things, I realised that we were actually different entities. So I went through some kind of struggle and realised that at the end of the day, Noble Ape was about simulation. It was about a variety of different forms of simulation. You and I had the opportunity of, working on book chapters together, so you have some sense of the background of Noble Ape, and I've continued that. I've atomised a lot of the ideas. I've changed some of the simulation aspects. Bob Mottram, the roboticist who worked on Noble Ape for about 3 years, is now working with an open source company in the UK, so all his time is taken with that. So I've had an opportunity of teasing these things apart and looking at how you distribute the simulation environment with potentially a much larger simulation space, with the apes being simulated on individual computers and devices and all this kind of ecosystem stuff, like technological ecosystem. But it's been an interesting period. In parallel to this, just as I was probably in the last 2 years of Biota Live, I started recording another podcast called Model Rail Radio, and that took off. I mean, that was the Biota Live format, exactly, with people calling in and talking about what they were doing and all this kind of stuff, except associated with model railroading. And that just completely exploded. I mean, that's a thing that has a life of its own. We're recording the 100th show in January next year, and people are flying in and coming down from all over. There'll be actually, what looks like 20 plus, probably close to 40 people by the end of it that are actually showing up in my abode to record it live. So that gives...
That is so cool. And that's so far afield from artificial life.
Well,
so
actually,
is that another passion of yours?
The interesting thing is I'm not a model railroader, and they kind of sense that, but they then appreciate that I'm good at creating communities, and I've been very useful in creating this community. I actually think there's a lot of similarities. Artificial life developers are fundamentally creating universes that are that they can explore, that are highly detailed, that have eclectic things going on within them. And that's basically model railroaders too. The other thing is, when you interact with academics and artificial life folk, irrespective of how crazy and harebrained they may be to an external observer, you've got to treat them with a certain degree of respect, and you've got certain parameters that you can move. And the same is true with model railroaders. If you create a forum where they feel perfectly comfortable, they can talk about their particular interests, they can discourse. I mean, it was what was going on with Biota Live, but just with a vast... I mean, it's difficult to actually... It would be like Biota Live where I had 40 people call in every show, and, I mean, the size of Model Rail Radio compared to Biota Live was just overwhelming. But obviously, I still developed this simulation. And the community that was part of that, it's not really there anymore. So I feel and the younger generation, I've done interviews and corresponded with, university folk, university graduates who are just coming into this field and want some, and the best feedback actually I got from the Artificial Life Conference was the number of academics that came up to me and said Biota was really an important part of what they did. It was almost like a tutorial group. It made them... There were a group of Polish academics that said that they felt before Biota Live, they just felt isolated. And through Biota Live, they could reach out to a broader community, which I kind of gave in audio form.
Oh, yeah. No, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I had to go outside of philosophy, and I know... I've never met him in person, but Mark Bedell. I mean, he's
I've met Mark Bedell.
Reed College, is that right?
Yes, I've met Mark Bedell.
In Oregon. And I've never met him in person, but, Elliot Sober, the philosopher of biology, wrote, a couple of things about artificial life. Even Dan Dennett had mentioned it. Certainly. So it was out there, some of the big names, but really it was not a big focus at my university. Nobody in my department knew what the hell it was. nobody, the only advice I got was you're not going to get a job in artificial life. Your degree is in philosophy, so you better either, get over this little fascination or broaden your skill set, because it's just not a traditional philosophical subdiscipline. So it's very isolating when you're out there and everybody's working on, the traditional philosophical problems. And I kind of stumbled across Margaret Boden's book, Philosophy of Artificial Life, and that just blew my mind. I was like, wow, this brings together computer science and modeling and physics and, philosophy and biology, and holy cow, it was such a huge, mind-blowing discovery. But there was nothing to really tie it together until I started talking to you guys. I have had communications with Bruce Damer. In fact, some of his pictures of his plants that the artificial plants he grew with L Systems wound up in a paper I published last year. So I've had communication with some people in that community, and it's really gratifying. It's like, okay, there is actually a community. It's just really dispersed, people in all different fields all over the world. So yeah, I would definitely echo that sentiment that Biota kind of gave it sort of a home base almost. But I didn't realize you weren't doing it anymore. I thought that was still going.
I had a strange experience on the first day of the Artificial Life conference, because basically I gave seminars and actually tutorials mainly for the first day. I think it was either the evening of the first day or the night before, and I was walking through the conference and I knew everyone.
Oh, wow.
But none of them knew who I was, or they just didn't interact. There was a kind of nervous energy. I just went through and I saw Mark Badeau and I saw all these people. I was hoping to meet Larry Yeager. And then on the next day, I just went to... It must have been after my tutorials. It must have been the day following. And I was pulled into this little room by somebody. And there they all were. I mean, Chris Adami was there. There were a wide variety of folk that I had some connection with. And they were all interested in hearing my ideas. The problem I felt was, and they made me a member of I'm still technically a member of the board. Their problems were not my problems, and my problems were not their problems. And the learning that had occurred through the Biota experience couldn't translate to the stuff that they were doing. So I felt that there was just a distinction that wouldn't enable a degree of interaction. The problems I was having at the time, I mean, I work at Netflix. I was trying to bring artificial life concepts into Netflix at the time. I worked very hard on that project, but none of the broader community could really assist with that. And at the same time, I was also internally within Netflix trying to, explain and resolve some of these concerns. I mean, I existed as an oddity both within Netflix and also at the Artificial Life Conference in this regard.
Yeah,
but
you're like an exotic,
in some regard.
who is this person? But do you think it's because when you say you had different problems, do you mean your problems were more practical as a computer person and theirs were more philosophical as academics?
Their problem was just running a conference. I mean, their problem was basically getting continued funding and interest in the conference.
Oh,
and
I see.
Just organisational things. I mean, very basic organisational things. And Tim Taylor did help them through some of this, but I just realised I needed, if I was to have a group of peers, I needed them to be in a place where they would be able to, on a variety of levels, offer support and advice. So I tried to create this group locally to do that. And that was similarly here, I mean, the Bay, there are names like Kurzweil and, the Singularity folk and all these other kinds of people. And I'm just past that as well. So you have these people coming with this kind of narrative to the Conscious in the Cloud talks, and then you have people who are past it. But the actual infrastructure of creating a talk series that goes on in the evenings and all this kind of stuff. And we ended up having, because we released it in podcast form, more people listening to the podcast than actually attending the talks. Although we had a number of interesting people there. So, I think it's not that I would love to continue to do the Biota series, but I need people. It could just be me just giving a monologue
just
every
talking
recording.
about artificial life.
But I think the other thing is that I also became quite concerned that the work that I'd done, in part through interactions with a couple of folk at this conference, but also just in reflection on, once you go to a conference and you see papers being presented on artificial life as sanctioned by the International Society and the conference, and in particular when you see it as being part of a narrative which I would consider at least 20 years old, and really hasn't moved on through that because they've lost elements of complexity. The notion of open source within this community is, I find, quite curious. They just didn't seem to speak my language on a number of levels. So I started to wonder whether what I was doing with Noble Ape, I mean, although I'd used the term artificial life roughly for a decade, mainly because initially it was an obstacle to even call Noble Ape artificial life. There was a kind of existing, I don't know what one would call it, but an existing group that didn't want Noble Ape as part of artificial life. Having had this experience at the conference, I started to realise that what Noble Ape is just a bunch of simulations. And it's a series of layered simulations, and this thing called artificial life is something different. And I just need to accept that. And so then the context of biota becomes interesting. So, what is biota in this context, particularly with Bruce Damer in parallel to this, finishing his PhD, but also then being very vocal and almost to a certain degree hostile, associated with many of the ideas that I was trying to cultivate through the biota community. Now, Bruce and I, both in recorded and unrecorded sessions, have talked about this. I think he was most recently, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the comedian Joe Rogan, but Joe Rogan interviewed him last week and actually took him to task in a kind of 20-minute section associated with how various issues associated with the origin of life couldn't move to a concept of artificial life in terms of simulated agents or these kind of things, which was my criticism of Bruce's new perspective. But anyway, so it's interesting times for biota. I think there's still potential out there. There are lots. I mean, I get periodic emails from new listeners that have listened to it from end to end and have gotten a lot out of it, and it exists as a resource for people. That's great. Still.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's always going to live online, so it's still a resource. But you could bring it back, but it sounds like you really created a community with the model rail.
Well, in parallel to this as well, model rail radio.
Model rail radio.
In parallel to this as well, I've also, in again a 2010 time frame, I started talking with a linguist called Heron Stone, and then this thing became the Stone Ape podcast, which has a community as well, completely removed from artificial life and model railroaders. Although the model rail community has contributed a number of listeners into Stone Ape. And that's cool.
There's some crossover
to a certain extent. I mean, I guess disenchanted intellectuals are the crossover, maybe, who knows. But that has been an interesting process as well. And I think Heron, in terms of what he brings to the recording, has a breadth of knowledge through kind of the 70s, 80s, and certain aspects of the 90s in a very, LA, just in LA culture, which I've always been interested in, but never had someone such as Heron to be, a sparring partner, so to speak. So that has generated its own group. But then again, that's distinctly different from the biota participants and model rail radio. The thing that interests me about my conversations with Heron is roughly a third of the listeners are women, which I've never had in any forum previously. I mean, the biota participants are almost exclusively male, and the listening audience is almost exclusively male. Model rail radio has a number of transgender participants, and they, I think, probably outweigh the female participants, and then just a bunch of men. It's actually a well-known thing. I've talked to people about this, and there's a known community within the transgender community that's interested in model rail. Like, it's just a known thing, which you'd never know about unless you entered the...
No, I would never know about that. Yeah. That is a really interesting connection. But I think with this Stone Ape, I think it's obvious why. It's because you have your conversations kind of go all over the place, and you hit on all different topics, and it's very entertaining to listen to. So why wouldn't that be? I would expect it to be even 50-50, men and women.
Yeah, I mean, that's based on contact, so it could be that there are more women that don't get in contact.
Yeah. Oh, right.
But as we're doing this as a pilot, You've changed your careers and your location, a wide variety of things since we last talked. I mean, I kind of get that sense from talking to you.
Yeah, you only know the half of it. Wait until you find out what job I just got.
Okay.
So, yes, I left full-time philosophy professor job last year.